live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek.
In this video, we're going to talk about the episode A Piece of the Action, which is another one of my favorite original series episodes. So, in A Piece of the Action, the crew of the Enterprise goes to Sigma Iota 2, which is a planet that was visited by the USS Horizon 100 years earlier. The Enterprise's mission, ostensibly, is to figure out if there was any cultural contamination of the Ioshan culture, and if there was, to try and correct it. What they find when they get there is a society built on the model of 1920s gangland Chicago. Apparently, the Horizon had left a book on Chicago mobs of the 1920s, and this civilization, the Ioshans, who the episode tells us multiple times are very bright and imitative people, modeled their entire culture around this book. So you have these warring gang factions, the largest of which is led by a man named Bella Oxmix, the second largest of which is led by a man named Jojo Krakow, and then you've got a bunch of other smaller bosses. And basically they war for territory. Everybody goes around carrying weapons. The men that we see on the street are almost all carrying Tommy guns. The women are almost all carrying pistols. So it's a very violent culture. Oxmix is the one who initially contacts the Enterprise, and basically he wants them to give him advanced weaponry, phasers and things like this, so that he can take out all of the other bosses and run the entire planet. The Enterprise crew, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, who go down, are understandably reluctant to comply with this request. So Oxmix has his men sort of hold them in a warehouse, trying to ransom them for phasers from Scotty, who's now in command of the Enterprise. Spock and McCoy escape and go back up to the ship. Kirk escapes and goes to try and get Bella Oxmix, but Kirk gets captured by Jojo Krakow's men. And so basically the whole core part of the episode is just this sort of shell game of who has who. Spock and McCoy are convinced to transport back down, and Bella Oxmix captures them. then Kirk escapes from Krakow and goes back to Oxmix's headquarters, where he captures Oxmix and his men. Then Spock and Kirk dress up in 1920s clothes that they took from Oxmix's henchmen, and they go over to Krakow's. They initially knock out Krakow's guards, but then they get captured. It's just a whole shell game, basically. Finally, Kirk sort of starts bluffing his way through this by pretending that he is going to lead a Federation takeover of Sigma Iota 2. Basically, that he is going to act like the gangsters, but he is going to out-gangster them. And so this kind of works for a while. He ends up having Scotty basically teleport all of the bosses from across the planet to Bella Oxmix's office, and they are sort of theoretically working stuff out about how they're going, about how the Federation is going to sort of oversee this planet. At which point, Teppo, one of the smaller bosses, is like, you know what? There only seems to be 3 of you. And Krakow is like, they have a ship. I know, I was transported onto it. But then he's like, but I only saw 3 people up there. So the gangsters sort of collectively decide if there's only a handful of people from this Federation ship, they don't have to listen. They can take over the ship, or they can take over the planet themselves, whatever it is. At which point, Krakow's men show up and start a gunfight in the street with Oxmix's men. This is outside Oxmix's headquarters. And so Kirk gives the order for Scotty to fire the ship's phasers on a stun setting in a 1-block radius around the building. So he knocks out all of the combatants, and then all of the gangsters are like, oh fuck. It doesn't actually matter if there's only 6 of them. They can destroy us from space. It literally doesn't matter. We are powerless against them. So at that point, Kirk basically gets to sort of dictate terms of how this planet is going to be run. He puts Oxmix in charge. He puts Krakow in a sort of second-in-command position, and all the rest of the bosses just get to suck eggs, I guess. Like, they get nothing, basically. The Federation is going to get 40% of the revenue generated by the entire planet every year, and that's the deal. And everybody's like, yeah, that seems great. Rather than getting phasered to death from space, we'd love to do that. So that's how the situation on the planet sort of wraps up. Once they get back to the ship, Spock and McCoy are both unhappy with what's occurred on the planet. Spock, because he doesn't see how Kirk is going to explain to the Federation that they need to send a starship every year to pick up 40% of the planet's revenue. And Kirk just sort of like, well, we'll have it put back into the planetary treasury to improve the planet. And McCoy, because he has left his communicator in Bella Oxmix's office. And the problem is that because the Iosians are very imitative people, they will take the communicator apart, they will figure out how the circuitry works, and then they will be able to build space-age technology earlier than they normally would in the sort of timeline of their technological development. So that's the wrap-up of the episode. Now, there's some interesting elements here. There's not many massively strong social justice elements in a sort of strict sense, but there is this big important question of governance. How should governance work? And in a way, that is a social justice question, because so what Spock says, and I think this is right in many ways, is that while they may quibble with his methods, Oxmix's goal is essentially the correct one, to unite the entire planet under a federal government that can run the planet efficiently and effectively without a sort of political system built on violent gang rivalry. I think that's fundamentally a really good point. And in a way, it is almost an endorsement of a stronger United Nations here on Earth. Because, I mean, after all, in the Star Trek universe, Earth is united. It is one sort of centralized government that runs the planet. And it is exploring the deepest reaches of space. It's the leading planet, apparently, at least in the original series, of the Federation. It's this sort of amazing powerhouse golden age planet. So, and I think there's something to that. I mean, I think the general movement toward a more centralized global society in which we can be interdependent on one another rather than so much of our politics relying on warfare and conquest, I think is an ethically good objective. So there's that element of it, that question of how should government work. Now, the rub here, of course, is that Oxmix's plan is to gain sort of authoritarian control over this planet by killing off all of his competition, which is not quite as ethically sound. So there is that issue here. There is a distinction between a united planet in which people have come together and said our best interests can be served by mutually supporting one another's needs versus I have conquered this entire planet, and if you challenge my rule, I will have you killed with machine guns in the street. These are two very different propositions, obviously, and one is not ethically and practically equal to the other. And so ultimately, that is the solution that the Federation or Kirk really, kind of tries to impose on the planet. Oxmix will be in charge, Krako will be his lieutenant, and everyone else will not give them any trouble. This is the imposed solution. Whether or not it's going to work is actually a really interesting question because this is a top-down imposition, right? So this isn't a bottom-up solution in which the people of Sigma Iota 2 have said, here is what we as a society need. Here is what is going to make our society stable, productive, safe, equitable, whatever it is, whatever values it is that they want to achieve. The people of this planet have not done that. Instead, what has happened is almost like the Deus Ex Machina in Greek tragedy, an external authority figure, in this case Captain Kirk, has come in and said, this is how your society will run. Do it because I have the power to make you do it. And that's problematic in terms of actually building a functioning, stable society. So it would be really interesting to have an episode, maybe 5 years down the line, go back to Sigma Iota 2 and see what's going on. How that imposition of a socio-cultural political model has worked out. Now, the other thing that's important there is actually the question of the Prime Directive. Kirk does impose on this society a particular model of governance. And the Prime Directive, which I've talked about several times in this series of videos already, the Prime Directive essentially says you cannot interfere with the development of another culture or civilization. Their mission essentially is to go and interfere with the development of this culture. They are specifically going to interfere with the Ioshan culture. They're going to decontaminate if there has been cultural contamination in the normal development of this society by the Horizon being there. How do you reconcile that with the Prime Directive? Well, the way that Kirk ethically justifies this is that because they were responsible for the Federation, broadly speaking, not Kirk and the Enterprise, but because the Federation was responsible for interfering in this culture, they are now responsible for going and putting it right. And that's an interesting argument, because nothing, as far as I know, in the Prime Directive says you cannot interfere with the affairs of other people or planets unless you have already done so in the past. I don't think that there's that asterisk on there that says, in this particular set of circumstances, ignore the Prime Directive and do whatever you want. So that it's an interesting problem in this case. How do you deal with a situation in which you are specifically going to violate the main order, the main sort of overarching standing order of the Federation? And in fact, that's the only thing that really allows this episode to move forward, because if they were actually bound by the Prime Directive, as probably in reality they should have been, there's simply no way of doing anything to salvage this culture. Like, you have to just let them be on their own and let them continue utilizing gang warfare to solve their problems, as it were. So it's kind of a necessity more than anything else. And that's an interesting ethical problem, because this seems like a situation in which the ends justify the means. The goal of moving this civilization away from a gangland civilization outweighs the ethical concerns that are the foundation of the Prime Directive. So those are the big things. There's a couple of other things that I think are worth noting, but I'm not going to talk extensively about. One is obviously the negative portrayals or implications of Italian Americans. This is very, very much a problem with any sort of gangster movie or TV show or anything like this. Technically, these are not Italian Americans. They are Iotans. They're from Sigma Iota 2. But this is clearly inspired by the Italian mafia, which was the most successful of the ethnic mafia groups, the ethnic gangs in Chicago in the 1920s. So there's that element of it. The other thing that doesn't make any sense about this episode is why the Horizon even had a copy of a book on Chicago mobs of the 1920s. Like, this is one of the earlier space flights, right? We don't really get a sense in this episode how long the Federation has been doing proper space exploration and stuff. We know that at least as early as the 1990s, in this fictional timeline, obviously, there were these sort of deep space programs that were going, because in the episode where they revive Khandalip Singh, that ship was launched in the 1990s, and it's now just way the fuck out there in space. We don't know how long the space program was really going in this system. We don't have a clear timeline of the early history of it. But clearly, 100 years before the Enterprise, the Horizon was on subspace radio communication, so this would be a much more primitive spaceship. Makes sense that they would have books on radios and things like that, which is another set of books they leave with the Iotans. But it doesn't make any sense that one of the few books they would have and leave with the Iotans on this random planet would be a book about gangsters in the 20s. Why would you even have that book on a spaceship? And why would you leave it on this planet if you had it? It doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. So the entire premise of the episode is kind of insane in that sense.